Hello, it's Amy, and I thought I'd come back with The Lost Library by Walter Mehring. I posted a video a couple of days ago talking about how I picked up the book, the content of the book in general, and I read aloud the first chapter. And there were a number of you in the comments who seemed to be very interested in the book and to have enjoyed chapter one. And so I thought, I'm almost 3/4 of the way through in my reading, and it might be nice to circle back for myself and revisit some of the earlier chapters, and also to share these earlier chapters with you. So I'm going to start reading aloud here in chapter 2, and we'll go until my voice gives out. And so this is chapter 2. My father arranged his books according to his private classification. As I set about restoring order in the chaotic pile, it was as though I were painfully trying to reconstruct from the ruins of memory a landscape out of my childhood, setting up first the eccentric gables of horror stories, and going on to the towering mountain ranges of the world sagas with their glaciers of dead languages, their eternal snow of frosty truths, and dizzying crevices of dialects, on all the way to the far horizon of my own ideas. My childhood books and the Greek or Latin texts have been packed on top of each crate to convince the border guards of the dictatorship that the books were worthless trash. Elves and nymphs, Aristotle and Plato had withstood all papal bulls against paganism. Frog kings and sleeping beauties had survived the guillotining of the aristocrats. Eros and Thanatos had resisted all vaccination. So too this library had escaped the book burnings, the race persecutions. And it only reached me thanks to those ancient creatures of myth and fable whom I too had loved. For to my father's regret, I too had roamed through the enchanted forests and into the caves of dragons before I began the long climb through higher education to enlightenment. I began arranging the top books first. Modern parents worry whether children ought to be given access to all the hocus pocus of primitive sorcery and wicked fairies. They might as well debate whether or not the Eskimos ought to be allowed to keep their amulets and nagoks. From a literary point of view, little objection could be raised to fairy tales like Sleeping Beauty, Little Red Riding Hood, Puss in Boots, and so on. After all, their authors, Charles Perrault of the Académie Française and the Comtesse d'Aulnoy, had introduced them into the salons of Louis XVI. I'm not so good with the Roman numerals, but introduced them into the salons of Louis' aristocracy. And the tales were presented in so elegant and courtly a form, like the contemporary works of Boileau and La Fontaine, that they were everywhere received as the legitimate inventions of their royalist editors. The plebeian, in fact, the Asiatic pedigrees of these stories were not discovered until the 19th century, when German and Russian philologists began looking into their ancestry. Then the brothers of Grimm copied the stories down without embellishments, as they heard them from the people, in order, so they said, to save them for the poor and simple people from whom they had been stolen. But the material the Grimms were unearthing got out of their control, as so often happens in the sciences. The good philologists had intended to preserve the treasures of legend and myth stored in the minds of simple peasants and venerable nurses, but they stumbled on caverns where flocks of obscure succubi fluttered into their faces. A brood of vipers and basilisks crawled toward them, and the bloody stench of a witch's cauldron rose to their nostrils. At the same time, and again unwittingly, the brothers Grimm promoted a conspiracy which is permanently seething throughout the human race, the conspiracy of the children. For children with the malice of underprivileged dwarfs are always sabotaging the absurd realm of the giants, the grown-ups. Meeting the enemy squarely, my father presented me with Grimm's fairy tales and a reproduction of the original 1832 edition. And on the long winter evenings, when I was apt to get out of hand, he would reward me for eating my supper like a good boy by reading me the stories. To counterbalance the horrors, the cannibalistic giants and witches burned in ovens, he read the tales metrically, like poetry. He familiarized me with the art forms of folklore, and in doing this he taught me how to defend myself against the goblins in the chimney, the imps in the cupboards, and the nightmares in the billowing curtains. He put all my terrors neatly back in their compartments before bedtime. For he read everything to me, and concealed nothing, neither the wiles of stepmother queens who mixed deadly poisons, nor the misdeeds of robber chieftains who beguiled foolish maidens with 3 kinds of wine, cut up their bodies and sprinkled salt on the pieces. He recited the mad chant of the goose maids and their changelings, and he even read me the folk jest about the dishonest Jew whom the peasant lad with the magic fiddle forced to dance in the thorn bush. For my father refused to practice any censorship in the arts. When he took me to the museum, he showed me the caricatures of Jews on Gothic plaques, and he dealt as frankly with the fairy tales. After all, the Grimm brothers had belonged to the Goddington Seven, a group of liberal university professors who were banished for conspiring against the almighty Prince Metternich and the King of Hanover in the dark days of absolutism and reaction. My father saw to it that the fare of my intellectual suppers was of choicest quality. I was piled with the finest translations, and at the time no other European literature had so rich a store of good translations as the German. In the 18th century, the Germans had shown every indication of becoming the encyclopedists of the heart, as the French were the encyclopedists of the mind. They were well on their way to being aesthetic mediators between the Latins and the Slavs. It had all begun with the reformer of taste who taught the Germans to appreciate folk poetry, Johann Gottfried von Herder, the Protestant pastor and humanist. Herder translated and adapted from all the world's Nautropsy. He provided the Germans with a psalter of Hebrew, Persian, Scotch, Lap, Estonian, and Greenlandic folk songs, and with translations of the Cid and Ossian. He wrote for them a gospel of singing nature and preached the equality of all nations in the realm of aesthetics. Thus, the religious instruction I received at home was strictly literary. It followed the catechism of ethical beauty and encouraged the worship of artistic perfection, in which everything had its place: minerals, plants, animals, and men. I believed in the Olympian gods, in satyrs and sirens, in Amor and Psyche, as firmly as I believed in Allah, in the 74 Hours, in Jinns and the Roc, that great bird. I believed in Homer, Scheherazades, and Wilhelm Hoff, the satanic romanticists of German adolescence. I believed in the pantheism of Hans Christian Andersen, who endowed swallows, snowflakes, bootjacks, and shirt collars with human characteristics, and who had the gift of tongues, a Danish Francis of Assisi conversing with domestic utensils. And I believed in the divine order of La Fontaine's animal world. I respected the animals more than the appended human moral. The autonomal whispers of the Erkling's daughter stirred me more than the jubilation of angels plucking their harps on the steps of the throne of eternal justice. I was more interested in the mandrake than in the sacred rose. The sufferings of Tantalus from hunger and thirst were grimmer and more real to me than the torments of Job. I felt the plight of a shade in Hades more keenly than that of a soul in the fires of purgatory. I had more admiration for the 12 labors of Hercules, for his struggle with the centaurs, and his success in taming Cerberus, than for Samson's suicidal revenge upon the Philistines. This went so far that when I entered school, I felt like a foreigner among my new classmates whose preschool education had been in the figurative language of the Old and New Testaments and in patriotic mythology. However, as I now saw, there had been no lack of Bibles in my father's library. About a dozen folio volumes lay, because of their size and weight, at the bottom of the biggest crate underneath the encyclopedias with which they had formerly shared one of the taller middle shelves. They had leather or shiny cloth bindings, stamped with Hebrew letters or the curlicued Gothic letters of the Lutheran Wittenberg folios. Many of them were critical revisions of the Word of God, edited by progressive theologians along modern lines, to prove that the revelations and the miracles are not to be rejected as mere deceptions of the priests, but should rather be interpreted as fundamental source material for the historical science of religion. In sorting out all the Bibles, I found a number of separate volumes containing parts of the scriptures, which my father had scattered among thoroughly profane bookshelves. Their environment seemed to have worked a total change in their pious character, as though they had been removed from anonymity of the one and only whose name cannot be named with impunity, and handed over to the collective responsibility of secular authors. This regrouping was not just a bibliophilic crochet of my father's. It went much farther back, to reason's declaration of independence from faith. That break had been as revolutionary as the revolt of the sciences against theology and Aristotelian scholasticism. Natural science had declared, "We want to learn the naked truth," and aesthetics had proclaimed, "We want to strip beauty naked," just as Descartes had announced the autonomy of the thinking self, Kant the autonomy of the moral self, so Lessing, Winckelmann, Schiller, Coleridge, and Wordsworth had asserted the independence of the imaginative self. Thereby they had founded republics of criticism, those of Sainte-Beuve in France, of Carlyle and Ruskin in England, of Fontaine, Fritz, and Mautner, and Hardin in Germany, of Brandes in Scandinavia, and Belinsky in Russia. After Hegel, the philosophy of the raison d'être after Taine, the philosopher of artistic reason, it had become standard practice to assess all cultural works as products of race, milieu et moment. In the re-examination of all printed matter, the Book of Books had lost its right to transcendental extraterritoriality. It was no longer inviolable. In its fight for existence, it had to appeal to all, the control commissions of literary and textual criticism, and it was constantly being reassigned to new categories. All this was a consequence of the above-mentioned great European battle of the books, which Swift described. It ended with the victory of the moderns over the ancients. Charles Perrault, the writer of fairy tales, had started the battle with his panegyric upon the Sun King, and Swift had carried it on in St. James' Library. Perrault, who was attacking Homer, argued that contemporary writers were superior to the ancients, if only because they had come later, quite aside from their more precise psychology, their improved methods of logic, their possession of printing, etc. Their advantages, in other words, lay in their belonging to a superior progressive era. Implicitly, this degradation of the classics involved the Bible. The damage was already done. The logical next step came from the far-sighted naturalist and sensitive court author, Georges Louis Leclerc de Buffon, director of the Jardin du Roi. Ordered to draw up a catalogue of the imperial collection of curiosities, Buffon overturned the whole story of the creation. His reservation that the account in Genesis should not be taken literally, and that the 7 epochs into which he had divided the creation corresponded, after all, to the 7 days, was of no avail. He had destroyed the basis of belief. Man, he admitted, trembled on the earth that trembled under his feet. The scandal was aggravated when Pastor Herder tried to save the Bible for literature by urging that it be read humanly and not as the Word of God. God does not speak, he preached. Consequently, there could not exist in any language an authorized edition of his works. Natural religion was taken up by the Protestant Church as a means of keeping up with the spirit of the Enlightenment, and Herder pushed this tendency to an extreme when he dared to claim that the New Testament was derived from an undiscovered Oriental source. He praised the Song of Songs as the oldest and sweetest love story of the East. He recast the Psalms of David into odes in the meter of the pagan classics, and rewrote the Laments of Jeremiah as a Lydian elegy. The result of his labors was that the church authorities condemned him as a free thinker, and he also ran afoul of his fellow poets, a Weimar, for he was meddling in both their trades. Goethe was particularly wary of him and carefully concealed from him my mystical, Kabbalistic experiments in chemistry, and especially my interest in subjects which could gradually be shaped into poetic figures, my interest in Faust. Goethe sensed what was going to happen to the Bible. He predicted a peculiar and inevitable destiny awaits this book, as well as all the profane scribblers. How right he was, my father's library demonstrated. My father owned a deluxe anthology adorned with vivid watercolors and borders imitating the motifs of Oriental erotic miniatures. It was entitled An Aphrodite's Garden of World Lyrics and contained Fitzgerald's Victorian travesty of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, anacreonic epigrams on heterae and minions translated by a classical philologist into German university jargon, the Renaissance sonnets of Louise Labelle, courtier of Lyons, to her aristocratic lover, recast into German by Rainier Maria Rilke, and with Mallarmine precocity. But the pride of the anthology was the Song of Songs, purporting to be originally an ancient Persian marriage duet of undisguised lewdness between Sulamit and Shulamo, who celebrated their nuptials without concern for possible symbolic interpretations of their ambiguous endearments, or for the ultimate consequences of these in the history of morals. Looked at in this light, the Bible became less objectionable to me. I had read it previously only in my class in religion, as I had read Goethe and Schiller only in my grammar class. When I had outgrown fairy tales and, with the beginning of sexual maturity, had lost the innocence of childhood, I could no longer abandon myself so harmlessly before falling asleep to stories of fairies and mermaids, robber girls and Indian princesses. I sensed this for myself and deduced it from certain of my parents' and teachers' questions. But love as it figured in the Bible, where it was meant only symbolically and with reference to God the Father, this heavenly love was too lofty for me. Yet parents and teachers always spoke about the operations of earthly love in careful circumlocutions and as something unappetizing, which was committed only in secret. They always added that before the time came for me to know what this earthly love was like, you will have to read and learn a great deal. And so I searched everywhere for the apple of knowledge, in the streets, in encyclopedias, and in novels of manners. Whenever I caught a glimpse of the other sex, whenever I found a mention of it, my pulse raced and my temperature rose, so that when I came across a collection of the 100 best short stories in a flexible pocket edition, I immediately took up the volume that contained the finest women characters, and when in this volume I discovered the Moabite orphan Ruth, I was enchanted. She had the bohemian charm of Mimi Pinson of Montmartre and the radiant freshness of one of the Goncourt brothers, Garçonnières. In this collection was also the Book of Esther, with its background of a Russian police state. It would have been quite at home beside a Russian protest novel, say Alexander Herzen's Who is to Blame. And there was also Judith, who kills the enemy general after sleeping with him, as daring a girl as Maupassant's Boule de Souf, the little Norman prostitute who goes to bed with a Prussian officer in order to save her virtuous compatriots. Samuel was evidently included in the collection with the idea of showing that it was a direct forerunner of the many-layered psychological or physiological novel of the type written by Balzac and Zola. These scenes de la vie militaire et scenes de campagne, and this histoire naturelle et sociale d'une famille, these Old Testament patrician chronicles of the rise and decline of a ruling house, of its blessings and its degeneration, of the tragedy of incest between two brothers and their sister, of political feuds, seers, madmen, and glorious artists in their crusade, force and succinctness. These stories surpassed all the long-winded exercises of the naturalists in the technique of the novel. And certainly Jehovah's reiterated threats of vengeance and of punishment to the third and fourth generation are more likely to make men doubt the existence of divine grace than data on social and heredity taints. In the Old Testament, the merciful mitigation of psychiatric or biological knowledge was lacking, and characters were abandoned to the judgment of superhuman conscience. The revolt of the servants of God and their defection from the doctrines of their forefathers seemed more monstrous than, say, the nihilistic blasphemies of the medical student Bazarov and Turgenev's fathers and sons, who worshipped the ball of materialism at German universities. In the book of Samuel, the dire fate of the monarchy began with Saul, Israel's first nomad king, by the will of God. The prophet Samuel forced this cunning, God-fearing military leader to abdicate in favor of the shepherd boy David, a military child prodigy whose like was to appear only once more in the history of war in the person of the shepherdess Joan of Arc. David was also a Baroque lyric poet, a political reformer, a pioneer statistician of his people, for which the Lord chastised him, and a common adulterer who sinned with a woman from a racially inferior vassal tribe. But through her he became the forefather of the blessed stock, the line of descent reaching from his bastard Solomon the Wise, all the way to the Son of Man, born of the immaculately conceived Virgin. But this genealogy lures the mind away from the faults and implications of Samuel. It leads to the tangled maze of testamentary proceedings carried on by casuists, distorters of scripture, and natural philosophers. It leads us also to the 100 years and 30 years religious wars, to the night of St. Bartholomew, to massacres of heretics and aristocrats, to chaffering over the rights of man that goes back to the marital relationships of Adam and Eve, old issues for which inheritors and disinheritors are to this day slaughtering one another by nations and by classes. For these were three ways of reading Genesis: the naturalistic zoological, the aesthetic folkloristic, and the socio-historical approaches. With all of them, and with the spread of novel reading throughout all classes of people, divine justice was more and more discredited. In the 19th century novel, the West discovered itself. By then, the West had colonized all the golden lands of Ophir, all of Sir Thomas More's utopias, and Rousseau's New Paradise, and had Europeanized their exoticism. The battles with dragons and the troubadour loves began to be located right at home, within the family, in the factories and the laboratories, in Balzac's boarding houses and Maupassant's houses of ill fame. Incredibly, savage tribes loafed around the London slums and the Parisian lower depths. Victor Hugo's Poor Wretches, Eugenie Sue's Asocial Scum, Mysteries of Paris, bomb-throwing Russian terrorists. All around the big cities stretched the darkest quarter of the globe. The provinces, the land of idiocy, of all milieux, the most stupid, the most prolific in absurdity, swarming with intolerant imbeciles. The hunting preserves of Gustave Flaubert. The novel is the 19th century as it lived and breathed. Here was the most detailed and treacherously revealing self-portrait of society. That society's urge to speak its mind, to talk about itself, and cause others to talk about it, has in fact been transmitted to us. It was an urge towards unrestrained histrionics, which often led to the trashiest kinds of falsehood, which was as overstimulated as one of the blue stockings created by the Amazon genius, George Sand, which blurted out horrible truths like a defendant in a Dostoevskian interrogation. The rise of Napoleon or of capitalism was a story so improbable that it could only have happened in a novel. The miracles of technology were so fantastic that they seemed possible only in novels by Jules Verne. When both author and publisher went out of their way to emphasize that the work was based on a true incident and taken from life, every reader became eager to live his own novel. The husband wanted a romance with his children's governess, or a real-life actress. The lady of the house wanted one with a Frenchman, the unmarried girl with a tenor, the son with his father's mistress. The servant girl longed for a count out of a tenpenny romance. The adolescent boy yearned for the life of coopers, trappers, and Indians. The proletariat hoped for the moral execution of the champagne-guzzling, caviar-gorging bankers who took advantage of every innocent working girl. But the true hero of the jeunesse dorée was the fortunate hunter, the Rastocurore, who, like Balzac's Rastignac, looking down upon the city of Paris, whispered to fortune, "À nous de maintenant." Both the most vulgar and the most snobbish requirements were satisfied by the literature industrielle, against which Sainte-Beuve launched his most profitable campaign. The serial novel, administered in the doses of increasing intensity, which was introduced by Dr. Veron in his La Revue de Paris. The experiment was adopted by the Boulevard Press, whose romans feuilletons could never pall, for every day the story could be broken off anywhere, with an enticing to be continued. These novels were completely in the spirit of the other contents of the newspapers. They were like criminal trials, unsolved murder mysteries, and political crises. In short, they resembled life itself. Whether disguised as historical romances, as in Bulwer Lytton's The Last Days of Pompeii, Flaubert's Salimbo, and Sienkiewicz' Quo Vadis, or disguised as detective stories, as in Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes series. These novels always remained snugly within the moral world order as defined by the daily newspapers, for the public subscribed to the principles of the newspapers. In the golden age of prosperity for clever and inventive minds, in literature as in other realms, it was the golden age of prosperity for clever and inventive minds in literature as in other realms. Subjects were cheap as dirt. Material for novels was as available as capital for new businesses. The society novelist kept accounts like tradesmen of the income and marriage portions which enabled their characters to afford carriages, banquets, and their emotional life. The novelist's own enterprises were also on a large scale, and their production broke all records. Alexandre Dumas had, to his credit, 257 novels, plus 20 novelistic plays. To keep the presses running, the writers employed a staff of ghostwriters. Like European civilization, the world of fiction was threatened by overproduction. The novel itself became the bourgeois family picture gallery, where hung oil paintings of Thackeray's snobs, Alphonse Daudet's financial nabobs, Oscar Wilde's Dorian Gray, George Sand's Consuelo, and Gerard de Nerval's Sylvie. Especially prized were the pictures of the owner's multitudinous kin, namely the Third Estate, in place of the plebeian Jacobin slogan, "Be brothers to one another." They had hung up a gilded scroll with the motto, "Be brothers-in-law and uncles to one another." These portraits were not required to be flattering, so long as they were good likenesses, as in family albums. And a number of attempts to produce highly unflattering likenesses were made by a German romantic novelist of the miraculous, the engraver, caricaturist, composer, and diabolist, E.T.A. Hoffman. Sometime before the chemist Joseph Niepce developed his heliography and the painter Daguerre photography on a silver plate, Hoffman had made a specialty of cutting silhouettes. His subjects were the shadow profiles of gnomic Philistines. At his desk, he was still obsessed by the mystery of physiognomy. He saw his characters as through a camera obscura, of the kind to be found in his day at every country fair, ingenious devices with an eyepiece like a doorkeeper's peephole, through which one saw, reflected on a prismatically illuminated screen and magically exaggerated and distorted, the most ordinary passerbys and the most trivial happenings. Hoffman was an eccentric, haunted by nightmares, his nervous system shattered by wine, debts, and sexual excesses, with the elfin schoolgirls under his tutelage. He was everywhere pursued by misfortune and failure. A teacher of music and drawing in Königsberg, he lost his job for making indecent caricatures. He was fired from a second teaching position at Posen for drunkenness. Director of the opera in Warsaw, he had to flee when the accursed Frenchmen invaded the city. In marriage, he was equally unfortunate. His wife became a permanent invalid and they lost their only child. As director of the Bamberg Theatre, Hoffman was forced into bankruptcy. His opera Undine was performed in the Berlin Royal Opera House, and the opera house burned down immediately after the premiere. At the age of 47, when he held the position of a judge in Berlin, he was stricken with paralysis. As the author of fairy tales and family novels, he would have come to no good either had he not amused a public with a weakness for magic stunts, elemental spirits, the title of one of his stories, and other such hocus pocus. His trick was that of the drawing room magnetizers, who invite a member of the family to come up to the platform and mesmerize the victim in an affected pose. To the uproarious applause of the good Christians, out popped a Beelzebub from the tails of a disfigured alderman, a vampire from the crinoline of a ponderous demoiselle, the concealed serpent from the false bosom of a faded coquette. Hoffman himself, in the trance of creation, suddenly became aware that the imagination can be made fertile by very simple methods. Horror often resides more in the idea than in the phenomenon. To put his technique in terms of old-fashioned photography, he placed a character before the lens of his imagination, which turned reality upside down, and out of the impression, the image made of him, he developed an idée fixe, a black and white negative, by exposing it to the full light of day. Or to put the matter in medical terms, he suffered from the paranoid disease of the alter ego, in which German original geniuses of the time were particularly susceptible. He was continually meeting his mirror image, his double. Even the staid Goethe in his memoirs reports a youthful attack of this. He describes meeting his own self while crossing a bridge. But Hoffman transposed the whole phenomenal world into the black and whites of a photographic negative. Thereafter, all the dualistic novelists set their cameras to catch similar effects. Charles Dickens snapped the light-shy fog silhouettes that could be seen by the glow of London street lamps. Edgar Allan Poe took pictures of spiritualistic ectoplasms, the case of Mr. Waldemar. Guy de Maupassant took candid camera shots of the marital bed and flashbulb pictures of a ghost from the colonies, La Horla. But the Russians above all went in for such photography. Gogol, Dead Souls, Dostoevsky, The Dream of a Ridiculous Man, Chekhov, The Black Monk. The original patent for reproducing all such hallucinations must, however, be assigned to the hypochondriac, spiritualistic, Royal Prussian judge of the Court of Appeals, Ernest Theodor Amadeus Hoffman. Perhaps the 19th century would never have perfected its novelistic technique had it not been for the military precision of an aide-de-camp in Napoleon's army of occupation in Prussia, Henry Beale, Stendhal, to use the best known of his pseudonyms. The son of a high official in the French judiciary, he received his education from priests whose teaching only deepened his scorn of religion and his materialism. As an army officer in the Italian campaign, and later as a diplomat, he became well acquainted with the political amorous intrigues at the court of princes, and among the clergy, supplementing his own experiences with his readings of Renaissance tales. As quartermaster with the army in Prussia, he studied the German romanticists, Hoffman, Jean-Paul Richter, Novalis, and acquired a knowledge of the enemy's psychology. He was given to an exacting correctness in all his relations with the outside world, in all situations. He was extremely finicky about his dress, for example. And there is a story that during Napoleon's disastrous retreat from Moscow, Stendhal reported to his general's tent in immaculate uniform and trimmed beard in spite of the raging snowstorm. He was equally finicky and correct about his emotions when he was jilted by a mistress, and he clung to this attitude when, after the fall of the Bourbons, he quitted public life and devoted himself entirely to the rich indulgence of writing for himself. These same qualities mark his biographies of musicians, Mozart, Metastasio, his reflections on painting and love, and his analytic psychological novels. His efforts to introduce his judicial precision, his psychometric measurements, and his sensualism into French literature were rejected by the public. It was not until the 1880s, 40 years after his death, that he was accepted by a public which was tired of romanticism, as Stendhal himself predicted in a letter to Balzac about his Charterhouse de Parma, which Balzac, almost alone among French critics, had praised. Alone, talking to myself, 2 steps from death, I am still a hypocrite, oh, 19th century. This pious exclamation from the last monologue of Julien Sorel, Le Rouge et le Noir, so the red and the black, who dramatized his attempted murder of his married mistress as an act of Napoleonic heroism, is typical of the strained pathos of Stendhal's characters. They wished to be great, but since they were living, in Stendhal's words, in an age of transition and therefore of mediocrity, they were forced to represent their wretched doings as energetic actions, and their weaknesses of character as a protest against the impotence of humanity. Stendhal was so contemporary that I did not care to reread him. I shelved his books and turned away from him and back to Balzac. Sensitive as E.T.A. Hoffman in perceiving the ghostliness of everyday life, as great a criminologist of the soul as Stendhal, Honore de Balzac had built a giant moving diorama of the epoch. Balzac's starting point was the observation that every individual radiates an aura of the will peculiar to himself, and through it influences the atmosphere in his environment. Equipped by nature with an abnormally sensitive eye, he was able so to disguise his photographic novelistic technique that, not suspected by the public, he assembled a complete rouges gallery of daguerreotypes of all his contemporaries. It grew to immense size. For that reason, my father did not quite know what to do with the few volumes of selections he had picked up here and there. Since he accepted Flaubert's verdict that Balzac was second-rate, Zola's that Balzac was too reactionary, too digressive, and Sainte-Beuve's that Balzac was a journalist, he placed the volumes among his romans feuilletons, journalistic novels, an act which incidentally would have delighted Balzac. Impressed by the experimental novel of heredity, my father deplored Balzac's disregard for the theme. He refused to recognize the power, the grandeur, and the uniqueness of Balzac, although no writer before or since has ruled over so densely populous a state. None has governed such vast expanses of milieus as this Rabelaisian bastard of the race of Gargantua and Gargamel. From his foxhole at Passy on the slopes of the Seine, laboring like Sisyphus under a crushing burden of debt, Balzac directed one of the most complicated maneuvers in literature, though often his style was inadequate to the task. At his headquarters, he autocratically knighted murderers, swindlers, users, and fools, and ennobled provincial misses, ballerinas, and courtesans. He decreed that the fate of a soap manufacturer, César Baruti, was more important to society than the career of a Napoleon. No secret service of a Talleyrand was ever so well informed on the conspiracies of the desires, above all on the passion for gold and the vice of miserliness. He penetrated to the highest ruling circles and the remotest provinces of hypocrisy. Fouché's police were never so conscientious in amassing information on every movement of thousands of persons, from the motive to the act. His eyes sleeplessly kept an entire human race under surveillance. None of his successors succeeded in maintaining an empire of such proportions. Gustave Flaubert, the judge of mediocrity, saw, like shorn Samson in Delilah's lap, the Philistines upon him. Emile Zola attempted to duplicate Balzac's feat, armed with all the equipment of genetics. In answer to Zola's appeal to decency, there roared back the voice of the human beast, the bêtes humaines. To investigate society, Zola went down into its pits and catacombs. He was, he boasted, one of the busy workers who inspect the structure to locate the rotting beams and internal cracks, the loosened bricks, all the damage which is not seen from outside, and which could yet bring down the entire structure. When Balzac wrote, the whole interior of the social structure and every human organism which inhabited it was made transparent. Zola used a pickaxe and laid bare the framework. He had a poor memory as well as poor vision, and therefore had to take note of what he saw on the spot. He viewed everything through the glasses of an undeniably magnificent temperament, but he overestimated the tools of his methodology and underestimated the miracle-working temperament. Actually, it was his temperament that made Zola the crusader of his century. Not for anything would I have denied the author of La Débâcle, this champion of impressionist painting, the accuser before the world of a gang of general staff officers who hid behind the skirts of La Patrie, his rightful place in my father's library. At any rate, not today, when I think of the literary minions of the social order who have burned incense against the stench of the death camp crematoriums, and who fell on their faces before every holy image of the overseer of world slavery. Now I think it's time for a quick sip of water here so I can keep going. Chapters in this one are quite long. Maximilian Harden, Bismarck's protege and the most redoubtable critic of Imperial Germany, wrote an obituary on Zola that amounted to an epitaph on the entire École de Modène. Zola believed in the sciences with all the fervour of a fearful soul who had been deprived of his gods and who hastily looks around on earth for supports. To listen to him was to be convinced that science had solved all the riddles of the universe. Virtue and vice are products like sugar and vitriol. The laws of heredity are as well known as the laws of gravity. Man does not act as he wants to, but as he must, and the factors behind this compulsion are no longer a mystery. Anyone who has staggered through a course with Auguste Comte and Claude Bernard, with Taine and the English geneticists, is familiar with everything, understands everything, and is immune to scruples and doubts. When Zola died, an era seemed to die too. The circumstances surrounding Leo Tolstoy's last hours create the impression that a saint was ascending into heaven amid fumes of brimstone and pitch. Even among the hardened rationalists who despised Tolstoy's quietism, the reports circulated like the rumor of a miracle that the dying man had sprung out of bed with supernatural strength to eject the priest whom Tsar Nicholas had sent him. Each of Tolstoy's angry epistles against the poisonous products of chemistry and medicine, against Shakespeare's unnaturalness, on the incompatibility of Christianity and conscription, on unchastity and marriage, stirred up Europe as though these were the theses of a new reformation, a new heresy. The three schematics of the age were Zola, the Donatist, the social sectarian who opposed the secular supremacy of the church, Dostoevsky, the Manichean, humanity is Satan's creature, and Count Leo Tolstoy, who proclaimed a city of God. Tolstoy's congregation was very large, especially in Germany and Scandinavia, and his followers boasted that in his Iliad, War and Peace, Russia had produced the only contemporary epic in world literature, which neither France nor England had been able to do. The heroine of his Anna Karenina is Flaubert's narrow-minded, hysterical victim of bourgeois marriage, Emma Bovary, transformed into a Mary Magdalene, even as the story of an adultery is transformed into a legend of sin and grace. Anna Karenina was, in the words of Dostoevsky, a masterpiece, with which nothing in contemporary European literature can compare, essentially Russian. Like a God-inspired desert preacher, Tolstoy wandered through a technological modern world. Right after his death, a blurry close-up of him was shown in a newsreel. He looked like a primal myth, a cross, struggly bearded, barefoot anchorite. Like a Renaissance altar painter, he reveled in the hues of the flesh. Anna Karenina's shoulders, bosom, and rounded arms gleaming like old ivory, the white breasts of a peasant woman in the square-cut peasant blouse, so white that they maddened him. the white threshing bodies of the soldiers bathing in the green speckled pond, and their brick-red hands, necks, and faces, and everywhere in the perfume and powder of the aristocratic woman with her scent of the boudoir, in the stable odor of a horseman, and in the sweat of a peasant girl smelling of rotten straw, in the stale smell of the unaired garrets and unwashed mistresses which clung to the social revolutionary, everywhere he scented the nearness of the tempter of the power of darkness. He saw Satan coming in Russia, and fled from him all his life, gazed at him in amazement from afar. He sensed that Satan was incarnate in Dostoevsky, for Dostoevsky declared, referring to his attacks of epilepsy, that he would sacrifice for such a moment of higher existence not only the life of one man, but of all humanity. Not so Tolstoy, who fanatically attached to life. He lamented over the rottenness of feminine as well as artistic beauty, over the spoilage of the fruits of enlightenment, and over the spoiled fruits of a diseased tree, with the same voluptuous horror with which St. Augustine of Hippo cried out against the corruption of Carthaginian theatre and Christianity. Both were apparently obsessed by the same compulsive idea. The full force of Tolstoy's primitive Christian ethics, and of his passion for the rude labor of the peasant, was channeled into hostility against his wife in particular, and against the torture of the marital yoke in general. His penitential piety originated, according to his own confession, in his frequent attacks of fear of death. He admired the Muzhic principally for his indifference towards death. Though he embraced the peasant as his brother man, his closest associates, the Tolstoyans who swarmed around him in his world-famous hermitage, were highly intellectual terrorists from the most dandified St. Petersburg society. The most terrifying aspect of the man was his relationship to God. Like two bears in a cave, Maxim Gorky reported after visiting Tolstoy. My father kept a file in which he collected bits of data on Tolstoy's personality. Tolstoy the field worker who perfumed his peasant smock, Tolstoy the Epicurean vegetarian, Tolstoy the denouncer of music who was privately delighted when Wanda Landowska played Bach for him on the harpsichord. My father had clipped the frequent newspaper items on Tolstoy's religious mania and the daily bulletins covering the old man's sudden disappearance from Yasna Polania. Even the rumors of a family scandal were here. His own wife's insinuations, which resulted in the 82-year-old Tolstoy being suspected of homosexual relationships. This Tolstoyana, and similar novels written by Life, literary borderline cases which might perhaps have been classified with psychopathology, were placed on the bottom shelves of a corner cupboard, which was half concealed behind the walnut armoire, where my father kept his private papers. Some of the most questionable material was locked in the armoire. My father had isolated these things as cultural curiosities, as one places in an insane asylum distinguished madmen who are, unfortunately, dangerous to society. There were books over which the courts and the psychiatrists, the theologians and the critics disputed. Were these books written by saints or imbeciles, by revolutionaries or asocial personalities, by original geniuses or degenerates, immoralists or pornographers? There were books which my father included in his library for their aesthetic or scientific qualities, but which on pedagogical grounds he wished to conceal from me. Perhaps because there was something obscene about their bindings, or so it seemed to me, especially those that were in tattered tissue paper wrappings, or perhaps because of the permanent semi-darkness in that corner of the library. There hung over them an aura of paternal taboo, which both frightened me off and irresistibly attracted me. And in fact, these mouldy old volumes dealt solely with the night sides of the soul, as the phrase of the day went, with the rudiments of primitive man, which, so it was said, inexplicably continued a vegetative existence in us, like the appendix and the spleen. A special ceremony was necessary to blow the dust from the edges and out of the grooves of the lettering, and to brush it off the covers before the distributable titles appeared. Hallucinative Pseudo-Epilepsy in Paul of Tarsus, The Confessions of St. Augustine, the story of a bisexual man, The Penitential Exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola, or from erotomaniac to saint, and packed with historical information and source material on satanic eroticism. History of the Devil by the Devil's most zealous biographer, Roxoff, a Catholic professor at the University of Vienna. These were the sort of books which are peddled around waterfronts in the neighborhood of waxworks and houses of ill fames by itinerant booksellers and junk dealers who are pulled from under a counter with a wink. The Nun by M. Denis Diderot, piquant inside stories of a French nunnery. Manon Lescaut, a terrifying picture of the morals of the French aristocracy and of prostitution in Paris, of the Louisiana penal colony and the American underworld by His Reverence the Abbé Prévost Exiles. There were also Diary of the Chief Eunuch of Sultan Abdul Hamid, Erotic and Political Life of the Sublime Porte, White Slaves of the Italian Mafia and Camorra, and there was a variety of other anti-capitalist, anti-clerical, and anti-Semitic books, a veritable black market of unsavory printed matter. It took me very little time to discover them, and I set to plucking out all the obscenities like juicy raisins out of a bit of stale cake. Some of my raisins were from Corvin's Paffenspiegel, a chronic scandalous for the use of anti-clericals. The Seventh Book of Moses, a potpourri of quotations from the Talmud, the Book of Sohar, and the Shulin Aruch, an anti-French and anti-Semitic pornographic novel, Biarritz, written by a down-at-heels journalist of the Revolution of 1848 and containing the proclamation of world power by the wonder Rabbi Lowe. All three of these books were afterwards republished by General Erich Ludendorff and the Nazi philosopher Alfred Rosenberg for private study and analysis of the World Catholic Jewish conspiracy. In unpacking the crates, I also found among this gruesome collection a bibliophic rarity, which I had never noticed before, an octavo volume bound in flexible polished leather, imprinted with the fleur-de-lis, Les Dialogues aux Enfers, entre Montesquieu et Machiavel. It was a splendid specimen of underground pamphletry by the Parisian feuilletonist Maurice Joly, written as an attack on the dictatorship of Napoleon III. It won the author fame for a day as well as a year and a half in prison, and then a posthumous fame of a sort he had certainly never expected. For secret agents of the Russian Okhrana used his pamphlet to construct a fake corpus delicti of Jewish Machiavellianism. The pamphlet reappeared faithfully translated from the Hebrew original into Russian by a St. Petersburg Orientalist, Sergei Nilis, allegedly had been discovered in destroyed ghettos by pillaging Cossacks, and it was used to justify the Kishinev pogroms. Beneath the ashes of burned Jewish villages, the fire continued to smolder. Like a carelessly discarded cigarette that starts a forest fire, the slapdash jet of a writer ignited a world conflagration. The dialogues aux Enfers became the protocols of Zion. The plagiarism of czarist anti-Semites was used by half-educated paranoid to burn to ashes Germany and the rest of Europe. With the stench of that conflagration in my nostrils, and the knowledge that the next gust of wind might set all Vienna afire, I started in alarm at the mere sight of a book that had left an unhealed trauma in my mind. It was the Malleus Maleficarum by, and this is from memory, Heinricus Institutus Kramer, Jacobus Sprenger, and Jacobus Grumper, Pope Innocent's the Eighth Encyclopedist, and there's another Roman numeral. These three writers with German thoroughness and with a disconcerting knowledge of pornography, but always leaning on Socrates, Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, St. Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, et al., describe the diabolic lewdness practiced by witches and heretics and the succubine wiles of women. These writers developed torture into an applied science. Each of these demonities, confessions, and voluptuous fantasies of flagellants, and stigmatists was a skilful brew. Each eye of newt, toe of frog, and liver of blaspheming Jew in a witch's broth, Satanism, scholarship, and social enlightenment were boiled together so spicily that they would inflame the blood of every virtuous spinster, as well as every populist. They would provide every roue with erotic tidbits and satisfy every adolescent's appetite for knowledge of forbidden things. My own appetite was satisfied too early. I became prematurely acquainted with the repulsive vices and diseases of a human imagination, and I regretted it. My father called this section of his library his poison cupboard. That was the word in university jargon for the special shelves of publications offensive to public order and morality, which were open only to students of the subject and to the judicial experts on public morals. While at the same time in the reading rooms of the public libraries, the libertines of power could sit with fervid brains and abstracted hearts and copy out of Savonarola, out of Clausewitz, the German philosopher of total war, out of Deroulede, the lyricist of French anti-Semitism, and out of Houston Stewart Chamberlain, the Anglo-Saxon propagandist of pan-Germanism, the tactics to be used for mass rape. What diabolic progeny of divine reason, unimaginable, what demons, what degenerate descendants of Brahmins, Yogas, Illuminati dwelt in such iniquitous volumes. What changelings were born of intercourse with incubi. On shelves above these stood the collections of forensic belles lettres, which I now came across in unpacking. There was the Causes Célèbres of François Goyet de Piteville, one-time advocate at the court of King Louis, another Roman numeral, one of the King Louis, containing the proceedings of the trials of the heretic Joan of Arc, of the incestuous rebel Don Carlos, and of the poisoner, the Marquis de Brinvillers. The book, which had been translated into German by the dramatist Friedrich Schiller, provided a wealth of source material for both classic and romantic writers, for the novel, the theatre, and the opera. My father had also a German sequel to it, The New Pivotal, written by the patriotic lending library author Alexei in collaboration with a Prussian police commissioner, Hitzig. For literature owes to criminology some of its finest inspirations. A work of art is gestated in the mind like a crime, wrote Josephin Peladan, one of the fin de siècle literati, who won a reputation with the rabble more by notorious conduct than by his literary achievements. For although the newspapers of the day were full of his interviews with the Sphinx and his rowdyish Wagnerian concerts, his scandalous black masses, and his recitations in Parisian brothels, literary criticism took no notice of him. Of his few readers, only Strindberg praised him as the Juvenal of modern Paris. He began everything that goes by the name of symbolism. Peladan, like Strindberg, went in for the occult arts of the alchemists. He had a flair for the perfumes of fallen angels, and, as he demonstrated in his novel Ishtar, an excellent ear for the language of infernal propaganda. When many persons vigorously share the same feelings at the same time, there takes place a phenomenon which official science will continue to overlook for a long time to come. A new spirit arises, that is, the emanation of many wills condenses to form a mass, which is powerful and militant. In such a mass, the voice of the individual, no matter how strong or impassioned it may be, cannot withstand the voice of the collective. But men of culture were far too occupied with Louis Pasteur's hydrophobia vaccine to pay any attention to Peladan's collective spirit. Like Huysmans, Peladan was also placed on naturalism's index, condemned as an obscene mystic. Consequently, he was not tolerated in my father's library, which was reason enough for me to read him. My attention was called to him by a pamphlet full of invective entitled C'est Monsieur Peladan. Next to this pamphlet stood another indiscreet volume whose title fascinated me, Wanda Infers, Pathography of a Sexual Anomaly, or something of the sort. but unfortunately it turned out to be a sober psychiatric dissertation on the morbid marital life of a drawing-room poet, a member of the Austro-Hungarian aristocracy, Monsieur le Chevalier de la Légion d'Honneur, Sacher. Sacher was known for his novel of manners set in ancient Rome, Venus in Furs. This was volume 1 of a cycle entitled The Legacy of Cain, which he never finished. He was ambitious to surpass Balzac's Comédie Humaine, but he succeeded in immortalizing himself only in the realm of sexual anomalies, as the beaten husband. Wanda was his wife's name. For me, it was a horrible disappointment. The copy of Venus in Furs, printed on Japanese paper, perfumed with musk, and kept by my father in a cardboard case tied with a string, reminded me so painfully of my Latin teacher's grammatical excesses that I wondered what in the world was so disgraceful about this masochism business. I found the diametrically opposite vice no more attractive when I read the Marquis de Sade and his Times. The German biographer Eugene Düren, alias Dr. Ivan Bloch, gynecologist of Berlin's Bohemia. I later met him. He was a bookworm, a veritable Linnaeus of erotic flora, and the prize specimen of his herbarium was de Sade. Bloch spoke of de Sade with a fine enthusiasm. Sexual pathology, social history, literature, marvelous, phenomenal. Rummaging through my father's books, all I could find of de Sade's own writings was a slender essay, Idée sur le roman. In it I came across such observations as, my brush is said to be too strong, I am charged with painting vice in the ugliest colours. The reason for this is that I do not want to make vice attractive. Woe to those who garland crime with roses. That sounded more like a timid moralist. The biographical data about him were no more illuminating to me. Why had the Bourbon monarchy incarcerated him in the Bastille, the tribunal of the French Revolution in the Congères, and the first consul Bonaparte in the insane asylum at Cherton? The charges against him seemed to come down to no more than that he had fed bonbons containing Spanish fly to some prostitutes of the Marseille waterfront. Once, when I pertly brought up the subject in order to get my father to tell me something more about the procedures of sadism, my father said the Marquis de Sade was an aristocratic libertine, and it is said a descendant of Petrarch's Laura. But I was not interested in that, for it is the fruit of universal education that every half-wit knows that Petrarch was a Renaissance poet who had a beloved named Laura. Just as everybody knows, thanks to Rostand, that Cyrano de Bergerac had a long nose, while Cyrano's magical novel, L'Autre Monde, that boldest and wildest of all the interplanetary voyages, that rocket flight into the sun, has been snubbed by posterity, as Petrarch was by his Donna Laura. Every two-bit journalist and every reader of the tabloids, as well as every demagogue nowadays, throws the cliché sadistic at the enemy, and every historian of literature uses the word when no other adjective is convenient. Yet the legitimate descendant of Laura, de Sade, has remained as immortally famous as Petrarch, or rather immortally infamous. For although the National Convention of the French Revolution, acting with the stern morality of ideological sex murderers, destroyed the Marquis de Sade's principal work, de Sade left his mark not only in the sign of Cain that was afterwards branded on the brow of voluptuaries of violence, but in the legacy of atrociousness which he bequeathed to literature. Everywhere in my father's library and in the 19th century I found his mark. Baudelaire swore by him quite literally. The French Pope of Literature, Saint Beuve, apologetically ranked him alongside Byron. Rimbaud invoked him in Une Saison en Enfer. Isidore Ducasse sang his praises in his Chants de Malheur. Swinburne honored him as his forerunner and recited him with transparent intentions to the muse of the Pre-Raphaelites. Naive Elizabeth Stendhal in his analysis of the conventional idea of God, Dostoevsky in his dreams of a pan-Slav Orthodox world church. Huysmans in his satanic Catholicism were sadists in word and thought. But of the sadists in this deed, the least guilty of all was de Sade. If we are to judge by the consequences which follow when any government, church, state, monarchy, or democracy acts in the name of the law, justice appears as an unnatural perversity. If any man is truly the image of God, we must conclude that the original is a hideous monster, a ball whose chief concern is to scourge mankind through murderous wars, revolutions, and diseases, a universal sadist. The bestialities practiced upon the human body in the world of De Sade were not inventions of an unparalleled monster. They were no more unusual than the acts of revenge wreaked upon the ladies of the French aristocracy for the delectation of the sans culottes, than the flaying, impaling, and the rendering of infants and pregnant women by Napoleon's famous guard, whose triumphs Goya recorded with his etching needle in his Desastres de la Guerre. However, the Marquis de Sade's crime was that he conceived his brutalities only out of purely artistic aesthetic motives, out of sheer pleasure in l'écriture artistique, like the brothers Goncourt after him. He was lacking in the moral earnestness which visualizes political terror as a means to an end, the end being to frighten potential apostates and to toughen the faithful so they will not succumb to sympathy when they hear the screams and whimpers of the tortured. The 120 Days of Sodom was the only De Sade novel that my father bequeathed to me, but during his lifetime he kept it hidden from me in his private armoire. And now, in the present era of sadistic action and masochistic thinking, I asked myself where I should place the book, with masterpieces of world literature or with cultural curiosities. According to my father's system of classification, the book belonged beside a 19th century satirist whose writings, even in his time, were as much bibliophilic rarities as those of the Marquis de Sade. Probably today, after the loss of my father's library, scarcely a copy can be found. The satirist was Oscar Penisa, a Bavarian Catholic by birth, an alienist by profession, Hoffmanist sadistic novel by vocation. His Visions of Twilight was confiscated immediately after publication. He was also a dramatist whose plays were never produced, and an avant-garde poet. His poems, entitled Parisiana, were brought out in a first edition of 300 copies, went unsold, and were never reprinted. After the publication of his heavenly tragedy, The Council of Love, Penisa was indicted for blasphemy and the distribution of obscene literature. Sentenced to prison, he fled to Zurich and lived there by the sale of his booklets. Christ in the Light of Psychopathology, A Feminist in the Cult of the Messiah, and others. Suddenly, he returned to Germany to serve his sentence. Apparently, he considered it his inescapable fate. An alleged fit of insanity resulted in his being sent to a private sanatorium. His Munich coffee house colleagues claimed he was sent there because his uncle, a Jesuit, intervened at the request of his family, as the Marquis de Sade's mother-in-law had done. He remained in the sanatorium for 20 years, shut off from the outside world, and continuing to write until his death in 1922. Like the Marquis de Sade at Cheriton, no one was permitted to visit him. I tried in vain to do so. A Munich cabaret proprietor obtained part of Penisa's manuscripts, but he himself subsequently went insane. Oscar Penisa's principal works vanished without a trace, like the Marquis de Sade's. Biblical diabolists, poets damnés of artificial paradises, historians of Sodom and Gomorrah, where did they all belong? Among the poetry of all ages and people, among medical documents, in the blazing pyres of the Inquisition, or in the bonfires heaped high with books by our modern terroristic dictatorships, or in the inferno of thought. When someone thinks and can no longer impart his thoughts to others, says Penisa's devil in The Council of Love, that is the cruelest of all tortures. And my voice is just about giving out here, but we have made it through chapter 2.